I'll be talking about online group PK experiments. Now, I'll be using a grounded theory approach, and that differs from standard parapsychological paradigms. You start off by collecting data, then you code similar concepts, you form concepts into categories, you note patterns, and then that results in proto theories, beginning of a theory. You test hypotheses derived from that, and then you just go around continuing the cycle. And this is particularly appropriate for analyzing qualitative data and theory development from analysis of qualitative data. So it's particularly appropriate for psychical research. Now, I'm engaging in participant observation. We're not going to be verifying that the phenomena is authentic. We're just going to be observing and looking for patterns in the data. Here's I've done a lot of research observing shamanic practitioners all through Asia. Here's a Korean lady. She's in trance. She's speaking in trance. She wears a special costume. At the end of some of these rituals, they sharpen a chopper blade. They put two chopper blades on the floor, and then the practitioner does a kind of dance on top of the blades. Had a chance to check the blades afterwards. They're extremely sharp. It's not a fraudulent. You can't say whether this is a paranormal or not, but it's kind of like a gymnastic feat, and a lot of these rituals involve kind of mind-body relationships. Here's one of my favorite people in Bangkok, Thailand. She puts these skewers through her cheek and tongue, and she's actually performing kind of a comedy routine. The people are laughing. It's kind of symbolic. At the end of the ritual, she puts her bare foot on a red-hot iron plate and then touches it to infirm parts of the body of where people are experiencing infirmities. So there's a spiritual healing component. I did fire walking in Mount Takao, Japan. That was my first fire walk. I mastered the art of fire walking, conducted fire walking workshops in Okinawa and also in the United States. Uh, Again, we're not drawing the conclusion that this is paranormal, but I want to gain insight through participant observation. Here I'm walking on a fire bed. I'm measuring the temperature is 888 degrees. I've walked on fire beds which are close to 1,000 degrees. I understand that skeptics have theories regarding how this is done, but those theories don't help you actually do the fire walking. I took part in research with the Society for the Research on Rapport and Telekinesis. They do table tipping experiments. They get the table up, then they grab their cameras and take photographs of it. They contacted J.B. Rhine. He sent William Edward Cox to investigate. Cox created these, they call them mini labs. It's an inverted glass box that's sealed closed, has micro switches in the floor, so if anything moves, it switches on a camera. Here's a film they made, and it shows these leather rings leaking. They also have films of objects moving around inside, moving in and out of the box, pens lifting up and writing messages, also pinwheels inside turning very rapidly. So it's what they do. So it's participant observation, and this is a quote from Yogi Berra, a famous baseball player in the United States. He says, "You can observe a lot by just watching. Puedes observar mucho con solo mirar." So I hypothesized that Paleolithic people discovered ways to induce group anomalous experience, such as spiritual healing, shown here in this image. They had the capacity to do incredible symbolic art 50,000 years ago, so experts say they're probably engaging in shamanic practices for 70,000 years. So that led me to devise what I refer to as a ritual healing theory. Shamanic rituals lead to hypnotic placebo effects. This is not that controversial an argument. Those effects are associated with absorption, dissociations, different types, hypnosis, and other shamanic variables. Thus, these variables are correlated with anomalous experiences. The theory is that leads to belief, and the belief leads to shamanism because of this propensity. These are the ideological foundations for shamanism. So we have a cycle that's been going on for 70,000 years. It's had genetic impact on human beings, and so we presently have the capacity for religiosity and spirituality. Now, this particular study that I'm going to be going over focuses on this element of the theory, the connection between anomalous experience belief and the shamanic ritual. Bachelor's artifact induction theory is applicable to this research. Bachelor took part in table tipping experiments. He argued that involuntary muscular movements or pushing the table around in the dark was a factor. The table moved without explanation according to the people participating in the darkness. And that helped them reduce factors which would thwart the phenomena, fear of psi and ownership resistance. The idea that the person was actually generating the phenomena would thwart it. So exposure to the artifacts overcomes inhibitions and generates belief, and belief facilitates the actual authentic PK. Now, Batchelor found that when he tightened up his experimental controls, that thwarted the phenomena. So he revised his theory and talked about a universal creative principle that maintains normal reality. And he argued that the PK can occur based on belief when there were pockets of indeterminacy. So within this paradigm, we're not trying to thwart, we're not trying to take out all artifact possibility, because artifacts are inherently connected to the phenomena. He argues that PK is a localized disruption of a shared, normal, or consensual reality. So it's an alternate paradigm to the traditional parapsychological arguments. Now, Philip group experiment in the 70s is also applicable. The group devised a fictional story regarding Philip, a 1600s aristocrat who was silent while his mistress was burnt at the stake as a witch. And this caused great remorse in this fictional character, and so he committed suicide. So the group wanted to contact him, and they experienced table vibrations, even table levitations, rapping sounds which could communicate with answer questions, breezes, echoes, and the story seemed to be a factor. In other words, the story shaped their experience. So there were alternate stories and replications of this experiment, and that seems to indicate the importance of a narrative. And to my mind, as a sociologist of religion, this might play a role within shamanism. You have a story and then you get effects. So I did attempts to replicate Bachelor's work, and they were all failures. I contacted him. He said it's not very difficult, but it was for me. Then I put together online experiments in 1919, did pinwheel experiments in 2020. We got blink cameras, which are motion activated, in 2021, and finally got a publication in the Journal of Scientific Exploration. So here's our experimental setup. Go everywhere, do everything, fear nothing. We named our pinwheels Alice, Lefty, Smiley. They turned when the group met. We had blink cameras, which activate when the pinwheels turn. We have a cell phone camera, which allows the people to watch the cameras during the cell meeting. And we got a bunch of poltergeist phenomena, and I put that on the altar. We have religious objects, which protect us from demons. And so that's our experimental setup. We closed off the vent in the ceiling, put a blanket over the window, have a mobile which turns if there's air disturbance in the room. But here's the experimental setup with the two blink cameras watching the pinwheels. We put a glass covering over the pinwheels. They don't turn. Without the covering, they do turn. Here's what it looks like. And Lefty will turn around pretty easily, but if you put the covering over, then the turning stops. So that supports Bachelor's theory, to my mind. There's an argument that perhaps the heat from the cameras causes the turning, so we did an experiment in 2022, cover over the camera. Here's what it looks like. The pinwheels still turn. The one under glass doesn't turn. So it's not turning, but here Lefty's turning with the coverings. So that resulted in a publication in 2024 recently in the Journal of Scientific Exploration. We have a group meeting hypothesis, the argument that when the group meets, that facilitates the turning. In particular, conversational topics seem to facilitate turning. talk about psychical research, anomalous experience, occult traditions, and psychic readings. We also noted that when we observed the pinwheels they stopped turning, so that coincided with Bachelor-Dorr's theory. Observation seems to thwart turning. So we developed coding conversations. Here's the guidelines. We have guidelines. We tried to develop guidelines for emotions, but I couldn't seem to get a valid, reliable strategy. So I got strategies for psychical research, anomalous experience, occult traditions, psychic readings, also meditation, miscellaneous as everything else, and the observation, but that seemed to thwart turning, we observed. So here's our hypothesis for this experimental series. The group meeting hypothesis, the direct observation hypothesis, the argument that looking at the pinwheels and remarking about them should reduce the turning, and the conversation content hypothesis. Eric Dellen suggested we put the pinwheels in an open mouth container, and so we did that. And of course, the hypothesis would be that the turning should occur. It's possible because the skeptics would thwart it because of the open mouth container. But we would expect it to be reduced compared to these other pinwheels because they could be affected by lateral air currents. But that wasn't really the case. We put it in the glass container, and the camera stopped functioning, even though this pinwheel started turning and the others stayed still, the pinwheel here in this glass container. So that was kind of strange. We had some very anomalous lights occur, and then the pinwheel inside the container started turning very, very rapidly. Later on, I put this paper covering over it, and it stopped. I removed the covering. It became active again. I put half covering on, and it still turned. So it's like it would seem like maybe the camera heat was a factor. Put a 2/3 covering, and it stopped. I reduced the 1/2. It started turning. There seemed to be limited activations during the sessions. There were activations when we weren't meeting, but many activations when we were not meeting, but no activations when we were meeting. So that's counter to our hypothesis. So eventually I thought, well, let's put a cover over this that would reduce the heat, and then left Alice here stop turning. So that supports a skeptical hypothesis. But then these two pinwheels started turning, so that supports a believer's hypothesis. And the group said, they wanted me just to take out all the plastic, so I did. And then we had a burst of activity from all the pinwheels. So I'm not sure how to interpret it, but it leads to a hypothesis that the trickster effects are due to conflicted outcomes, which are experienced by both skeptics and believers, and that possibly there's future observers playing a role. And you have both skeptics and believers, and you'll get this trickster effect. Here's YouTube videos that show all our experiments. The early stage, we had the covering on. The later stages, the covering has been removed. The orange is during the experimental activations. This is when we remove the dome, had a burst of activity, another burst, and then all this activity at the end. And then testing hypothesis 1, the 6-day average before each session averaged about 13 activations. During the experiment, we had like 66, so that's a very significant difference. Very high effect size. Seems that the group really causes contributes to the turning. Hypothesis 2, we're looking at periods when we're looking at the pinwheels. There were 45% of them were rapid turns. During non-observation, it's only 34%. That difference is significant, but it's opposite what we predicted. So some people might say, well, maybe we're getting over our fear of psi or whatever. It's hard to think along those lines because I don't think these people are really very afraid. Maybe the pinwheels turn, so they just say, hey, let's all look. And during this series, it did not slow down. Hypothesis 3 is the conversation content hypothesis. During psychical research, 40% were rapid turns. During occult traditions, 45%. So these two factors contribute to a highly significant result. So that supported a hypothesis 3. Here's a summary of the results. Pinwheel turning occurred more often when the group was meeting. Observation did not thwart the pinwheel turning. and certain conversations, particularly psychical research and occult traditions, were associated with rapid pinwheel turning. So here's our subjective observations, and it bothers me a little bit that I have to, in order to get this, permission to present the paper, I have to uh, go over all the statistical evaluation. The real things that affected our belief were poltergeist events that happened in people's houses and the groups. The phenomena while we were meeting transformed belief. It had a transformative quality that seemed like the pinwheels were participating in a group conversation. And just event after event led us to believe it. Like, for example, they'd been still for many days. Then I mentioned my deceased brother, and the pinwheel just leaped into action. It affects your belief when you're exposed to things like that. Many of our experiments failed. It seemed like the phenomenon has a creative quality. So it made me think maybe Bachelor is correct. There's all kinds of trickster effects, equipment failures, changes in pinwheel turning, and then the poltergeist phenomena. Like, for example, we had these anomalous lights. I wasn't home when this happened. It was a very, very dark day. The total cloud cover outside, and this light flashes. This is one of a series of 8 activations of the camera, which were at different time periods during that morning. Sometimes the light moved around on the tablecloth and varied in intensity. Here's another activation that happened fairly recently. Lights flashing. The window is closed, covered over with the blanket, yet the lights coming. This is one of 2 different activations which were similar. So we put together a qualitative research plan. I wanted to select strong and weak samples. So we assembled a strong sample, a set of strong sample turns, equivalent weak sample turns. We wanted to look at the factors and wanted to think how would the strong factors contribute to religious beliefs or religious narrative. Here's the strongest turn during this year of this experimental series.
Maybe after we die, we are able to do that. We think in way more dimensions, not only fourth or fifth, but so many dimensions there are, and suddenly we will be able to.
So that's Boris. He lives in Germany. English is his second language, and we'll look at a weak sample. I've matched it, so we'll hear Boris speaking again.
I guess we should use something like a pendulum. We have to. No, we have to. It's like an order telling us to. At least that's my interpretation. When we mentioned the pendulum, they all started to move.
See, there's an observation. He saw the pendulum moving, and so we did indeed put a hanging object, like a pendulum, there as part of our experiment. In response to that, so here's our comparison of samples. Psychical research, the idea everything is connected to everything else, the quantum theory of life after death and dimensions. You saw that example. Art by Ingo Swann as a remote viewer. My meeting with Russell Targ and Ingo Swann. The deaths of Ingo Swann and Pat Price. Traveling with Hans Bender. And rejection of Surratt by the parapsychologists, the stigma associated with that. Then there were 3 narratives from the occult traditions. They all had to pertain to star knowledge, which is derived from traditional and synthesized Native American Lakota Sioux traditions, and it pertains to the thought that our souls are connected to specific stars and that they're alien visits from outer space, and that affected our human history, maybe even our biology, and there's synchronicities due to that. The psychical research small turn sample seems to be quite different. Talked about making videos of each experiment, talking about the difficulty of talking about psychical research, a stigma, possibility the strongest turns occur after the session ends, talking about the previous pinwheel activity. You've heard Boris talking about the pendulum. Then we also had a theory about synchronicity and a theory about conservation of energy by the force activating the pinwheels, and then 3 different occult traditions which had somewhat of a narrow focus. So the The weak turns seem to have a narrow focus. The strong turns had a broad focus, and these strong turns seem to focus on creating or supporting an ideology. So, you have this turning, and it's like magical, and so it seems to be advocating certain belief systems, certain thinking about things. The magical quality leads a kind of rhetorical force to that argument. Now let's think about Paleolithic people have a life sort of totally different from ours. They're gathering around fires. They're doing rituals around fires. Their shamanism will be different probably from what we're developing. We're strangers. We're meeting online. Our lives are very different from theirs. So here's the collection of the stories, and here's my proto-ideology, my story, which I put together as a result of this year's worth. We have this magical event supporting this argument. A spiritual reality encompassing physical reality entails interconnectedness of everything. Life after death, humans, spirits, magic, stars. This knowledge is hidden. It's hidden because it's thwarted by skepticism. We can't get the phenomena, according to this orientation, you can't get the phenomena because. So this leads to theory development within the sociology of religion. We have a proto-ideology number one, which I just presented. Suppose we did the experiment in Mexico, we get something different. Suppose we did it in Brazil, we get something different. Suppose we did it in the People's Republic of China or in Iran, we get different ideologies, but there would be common features because the phenomena has a central core element to it. There'd be competition and synthesis. We end up with an innovative ideology. So this is a sociology of religion perspective. The conclusion is that these findings support Bachelor-Dor's model, they support the ritual healing theory, and they support theory development. I noted some of these items in red because they're particularly interesting and pertain to the trickster effect. And if you're interested, I invite you to contact me by email.